Island of the Blue Dolphins, Chapter 20. So, as we get started, let's go ahead and briefly review what has happened so far in the story. As you know, Karana has now been on the island by herself for a very long time. She has been working hard to make sure that she can live there. She built her own home. She built the fence with the whale bones. She went to kill the wild dogs, but instead, she made a friend out of Rontu. So she is living a pretty good life. She's fixed up the canoe. She's taken the canoe around the island and looked for caves. And in one particular time, she saw the devilfish, and so she wanted to hunt it because she liked the meat of the devilfish. So her and Rontu, last chapter, went hunting for the devilfish, the octopus, and they found it and they caught it, but it was such a battle. It was so hard that Karana goes, I'm not doing that again. So that's where Karana is now. So we're going to be starting with chapter 20. So please follow along with me as we read, and hopefully you'll enjoy chapter 20. I gathered 2 more canoe loads of abalones soon after that, mostly the sweet red ones, which I cleaned and carried to the house. Along the south part of the fence, where the sun shone most of the day, I built long shelves out of branches and put the meat up to dry. Abalones are larger than your hand and twice as thick when fresh, but they shrink small in the sun, so you have to dry many. In the old days on the island, there were children to keep away the gulls, which would rather feast on abalones than anything else. In one morning, if the meat was left unguarded, they could fly off with a whole month's harvest. At first, whenever I went to the spring or to the beach, I left Rontu behind to chase them off. But he did not like this and howled all the time I was gone. Finally, I tied strings to some of the abalone shells and hung them from the poles. The insides of the shells are bright and catch the sun, and they turn one way and another in the wind. After that, I had little trouble with the gulls. Maybe you've seen something similar to this, like when you've driven past a farm or something, and maybe you see these bright, shiny little pieces of paper or foil that they might hang out on a farm, that as the breeze blows, it catches the light, and that kind of scares off birds. So she used the shells to do that idea, so that the seagulls won't eat her food. I also caught small fish in a net I had made and hung them up to dry for winter light. With meat drying on the shelves, and the shells flashing and turning in the wind, and the strings of fish hanging on the fence, the yard looked as if a whole village were living there on the headland instead of just Rontu and me. Every morning after I had gathered food for winter, we went out to the sea. At the end of summer, I would gather roots and seeds to store, but now there was nothing that needed to be done. We went many places those first days of summer, to the beach where the sea elephants lived, to Black Cove, which was even larger than the first cave we found, and to Tall Rock where the cormorants roosted. Tall Rock was more than a league from the island and was black and shimmering because it was covered with cormorants. I killed 10 of the birds the first time we went there, and I skinned and fleshed them and put them out to dry. For someday I wanted to make myself a skirt of cormorant feathers. Black Cave was on the south coast of the island, near the place where the canoes were stored. In front of the cave was a high ledge of rocks surrounded by deep kelp beds, and I would have paddled by it if I had not seen a seahawk fly out. The sun was in the west, and I had a long way to go to reach home, but I was curious about the hawk and the place he lived in. The opening of the cave was small, like the one in the cave under the headland, and Rontu and I had to crouch low to get through. Weak light came from outside, and I saw that we were in a room with black, shining walls that curved high overhead. The far end of the room was another small opening. It was long and very dark, and when we reached the end of it, we were in another room which was larger than the first and lit with a shaft of light. The light came from the sun, which shone down through a jagged crack in the ceiling. All right, so a couple things. Number one, she talks about storing her food. We go to a store, which is a noun, but to store in this sense is a verb, which is the act of taking things and putting them away for later. So you go to a store, a grocery store or Walmart or Target, and you buy things and you bring them home and you put them on the shelf where you store them for later. So she is storing food for the winter. All right. She finds this cave and she crouches down. That's when you kind of lower your body to get through. Kind of a funny little picture here where she's crouching. Seeing the sun shining down and the black shadows drifting over the walls, Rontu barked, then began to howl. The sound echoed through the cave like the howling of a whole pack of dogs. It sent a cold feeling down my back. "Be quiet," I shouted, putting my hands over his jaws. My words echoed and echoed in the room. Echo, 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 echo. So to echo, this idea of hello, hello, hello. I turned the canoe around and started back toward the opening. Above it, on a deep ledge that ran from one side of the room to the other, my gaze fell upon a row of strange figures. There must have been 24 of them standing against the black wall. They were as tall as I, with long arms and legs, and short bodies made of reeds, and clothed in gull feathers. Each one had eyes fashioned of round or oblong discs of abalone shell, but the rest of their faces were blank. The eyes glittered down at me and moved as the light on the water moved and was reflected upon them. They were more alive than the eyes of those who live. In the middle of the group was a seated figure, a skeleton. It sat leaning against the wall with its knees drawn up, and in its fingers, which were raised to its mouth, a flute of pelican bone. There were other things there on the ledge, in the shadows among the standing figures, but having drifted far back in the room, I again paddled toward the opening. I had forgotten that the tide was coming in. To my great surprise, the opening had narrowed. It was too small now for me to get through. We would have to stay there in the room until the tide went out, until dawn came. So she describes these figures, and this is just a picture here, but these strange figures made of reed and a skeleton. Kind of creepy. That would be terrifying. And then because the tide, the water, has risen up so high, the hole to get out of the cave has gotten so small, she can't get out. And so she has to find a dry, high spot inside this cave, inside the rock. So she has to stay here until the morning with all of these strange, creepy figures. Ugh. I paddled to the far end of the cave. I did not look back at the glittering eyes of the figures on the ledge. I crouched in the bottom of the canoe and watched the shaft of light grow weak. The opening out to the sea grew smaller and finally disappeared. Night came, and a star showed through the crevice overhead. The star passed out of sight, and another took its place. A crevice, of course, is a tiny little crack in the rock. So she's still in the cave, and she looks out through the crevice, and she can see a tiny star up in the sky. The tide lifted the canoe higher in the room, and as the water lapped against the walls, it sounded like soft music of a flute. It played many tunes through the long night, and I slept little, watching the stars change. I knew that the skeleton, who had sat on the ledge playing his flute, was one of my ancestors, and the others with the glittering eyes, though only images, were too. But I still was sleepless and afraid. With the first light, another high tide almost setting, we left the cave. I did not look up at those standing quietly on the ledge or at the flute player playing for them, but paddled fast out into the morning sea. nor did I look back. I suppose this cave once had a name, I said to Rontu, who was as glad to be free as I was. But I have never heard of it, or heard it spoken about. We will call it Black Cave, and never in all our days will go there again. When we came back from our voyage to Tall Rock, I hid the canoe in the cave below the headland. It was hard work, but each time I would lift the canoe from the water and onto the ledge, even though I planned to go out the next morning. 2 summers had come and gone. Whoa! 2 summers! It's been 2 years. 2 summers had come and gone, and the Aleut hunters had not returned. Yet during these days I always looked for them. At dawn, as Rontu and I went down to the cliff, I would watch the ocean for their sails. The summer air was clear, and I could see many leagues. Wherever we went in the canoe, I would never be gone longer than half a day. On the way home, I always paddled close to shore and looked for them. It was the last time that we went to Tall Rock that the Aleuts came. I had hidden the canoe and climbed the cliff with 10 cormorant skins slung over my back. At the top of the cliff, I looked for a while, gazing at the sea. There were some small clouds on the water. One of them, the smallest, did not look like the others, and as I watched, I saw that it was a ship. The sun made bright scales on the water, but I could see clearly. There were 2 sails, and it was a ship coming toward the island. For a long time, I could not tell the color of the sails. I wondered if it could be the white men, though now I thought about them little and seldom looked for them. I left the cormorants hanging on the fence and went to the rock on the headland. I could see no better from the rock because the sun was low and the whole ocean was covered with light. Then, as I stood there, I remembered that the white men's ship would come from the east. This one had come from a different direction, from the north. I still was not sure that it belonged to the Aleuts, but I decided to pack the things that I would take to the cave in the ravine. There was much to take: my 2 birds, the skirt I had made, the stone utensils, my beads and earrings, cormorant feathers, and all of my baskets and weapons. The abalone were not yet dry, so I would have to leave them. When I had packed everything and put it beside the hole under the fence, I went back to the headland. I lay on the rock so I would not be seen and peered over its rim towards the north. For a moment, I did not find the ship, and then I saw that it had traveled faster than I thought it would. It was already rounding the kelp bed, close to the rocks of Coral Cove. The last of the sun shone on the ship, on the bow, which was made like the beak of a bird, and on the 2 red sails. I knew that the Aleuts would not come on shore in the dark, and that I had until morning to carry my things to the cave, but I did not wait. Most of the night I worked, making 2 trips to the cave. At dawn, when everything had been moved, I went back to the house for the last time. There I buried the ashes of my fires and threw the sand over the shelves in the door. I took down the shells I had put up to scare the gulls and tossed them and the abalone over the cliff. At last, with a pelican wing, I brushed away the marks of my feet. When I had finished, it looked as though no one had lived there for a long time. Why do you think she would do that? Why would she make it look like no one's lived there for a long time? By now the sun was up, and I climbed onto the rock. The ship lay at anchor in the cove. Canoes were bringing goods to the shore, and some were out in the kelp beds, beginning to hunt for otter. There was a fire on the shore, and beside it, a girl. She was cooking something, and I could see the fire shining on her hair. I did not stay long on the headland. Always in the past, I had gone to the ravine by a different way, so as not to wear a trail. This time, I went off towards the west, along the cliff, and then doubled back through the brush, being careful to leave no tracks. Rontu's prints did not matter because the Aleuts knew there were dogs on the island. The cave was very dark, and I had trouble getting Rontu to go through the small opening. Only after I had crawled in and out several times would he follow me. I closed the opening with stones, and since I was tired, lay down and slept all that day. I slept until I could see the stars shining between the cracks in the rocks. All right, so first she goes off and she finds this strange cave with these old ancestor bones. And then she packs everything. Again, this is a verb. It means not a backpack, which is a noun, but it means she gets everything. She grabs all the stuff that's important to her. And then I asked, why do you think she made it look like no one had lived there for a long time? Who are the Aleuts? Do you remember at the beginning of the story? They're the ones who came and killed her dad and a lot of her tribe. She's scared of these people. She's afraid they might kill her or take her away in a bad way. So she is lucky she has this second house. She's able to go and hide there. But don't you think she might also want to be with people? I don't know. I mean, would the fear of the Aleuts overpower the desire to be with other human beings? Because it's been 2 summers. Long time. All right, Karana's adventure will continue later on. So that was a good chapter. Chapter 20, she finds this creepy cave, and the Aleuts come back, and so she runs and hides. All right, we'll see you later with chapter 21.